At Simio, we're in the business of showing you the future. Our intelligent technology gives you unprecedented insight into complex systems to identify and solve today's inefficiencies and tomorrow's challenges. The Simio solution provides a low-risk opportunity to drive transformational change. Our true digital twin models capture all the constraints, business rules, and decision logic that define the operation of your system. When powered by your data, easily evaluate unlimited scenarios and deliver optimized solutions. No matter what industry you're in, eliminate your greatest operational process and scheduling challenges with a Simio digital twin. See your future success, Simio.
Perfect. Confirming real quick with Jason. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, I can.
All right, awesome. Thank you. Well, welcome everyone. Welcome back to the Simio Solutions Series. For those of you that we saw in 2022, we're back for another round here in 2023. That being said, we'll jump right into it. My name is Dan Vasilini. I am the VP of Global Sales here at Simio. Presenting today or doing most of the talking is going to be Jason Sarasoli. He's one of our project engineers here. And today's topic is simulation modeling, best practices and tips for success. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. Just be aware, today's session is being recorded for replay purposes. If you'd like to rewatch this session or refer it on to a friend or a colleague, it's going to be up on the Simio webpage. Usually we're able to get it up within about 12 hours or so. Sometimes it takes a little bit longer, all depends. But it should be on our website before the end of the weekend. Just go to simio.com and you'll see a link or an area where you can watch the sessions here. Be aware also all participants are on mute. If you wish to ask a question during today's presentation, somewhere on your screen there should be a GoToWebinar box. For me, it's in the top right-hand side. You can move this box around, but within that box there is a question area. All I'd ask is if you do have a question during today's session, simply open up that question box, type your question in, and we will get it asked. If the question is pertinent to something that Jason is presenting at the time, I'll try to interrupt or at least give him a little bit of break in his speaking. Ask the question and we'll jump back into it. If your question is more generic in nature or something we can address at the end of the presentation, we will jump into it at the end. Our session is set to last today for about 60 minutes. Jason will probably be presenting for about 40 of those minutes. So we do intentionally leave a little time for questions at the end. Upcoming sessions. So what we're going to do this year is we are planning on holding the session, one session a month, every Friday, and it's going to be the second Friday of every month from here until the end of the year. So as of right now, our schedule looks like, as you can see on the screen, we've got one scheduled for April the 14th, how to best implement data tables, and we will very soon be publishing schedules for May, June, July, and hopefully even further than that, so you can set your own schedule for the rest of the year. But last year we were doing them every other Friday, and then we started doing them every other month, and it wasn't necessarily set on the day. But this year we are going to do them, like I said, the second Friday of the month, so you can count on that as being the day, and it's going to be at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and it'll be every month. One more thing before we jump over to Jason. So for those of you that, if it's going to advance, there we go. For those of you who may or may not have attended, about less than a month ago, we ran Simio Sync 2023. It was our online conference, user conference. If you are interested, here is the link to where Simio Sync is at. You can go ahead in there and register to either rewatch any of the events, or if you weren't available to watch live, feel free to go in there and register, and you can watch any of the presentations that were done. And we had presentations from McDonald's, Alcoa, Bristol Myers Squibb, Northrop Grumman, and several others. All those presentations, like I said, are up there that you'll be able to go in and watch those sessions. They're each about an hour or so long with question and answers. Some good sessions in there, good question and answer, good presentations. So I'd recommend if you weren't able to attend Simio Sync, please feel free to use this link, get over to it. And if you can't find the link, if you can't write this down quick enough, I'm trying to leave it up long enough and talk so you can write it down. But if you can't write this link down or didn't get it right, it's also linked off the Simio webpage too that you can get right there. All right, Jason. So that's my last slide. It looks like we have a pretty good attendance level here today. So I will turn things over to you. Let me change presenter over to you, and you are ready to go.
Great, thanks, Dan. Hi all. So let me just confirm that you are seeing my screen, Dan.
Yep, I can see you. I'm not seeing
Great.
your screen, but I can see you.
Let me turn off the camera. Okay, let me know if you're seeing a screen now.
Not yet. All right, I'm getting an email that says someone's seeing it. Maybe I'm seeing the wrong thing, but yeah, let's go ahead. So
Okay.
I got a message
great.
that says they're seeing it.
Okay, great. Thanks for whoever confirmed. So my name is Jason Sarasoli. I'm a project engineer at Simio. In today's session, I'm going to talk about kind of a general concept of Simio modeling best practices. It's going to cover quite a few topics from getting started to more advanced techniques of debugging and documentation. I felt like this talk would be helpful for the audience because it's something that isn't really covered a lot. And when I learned Simio, which was many years ago in college, as well as when I started at Simio here, I learned all these things along the way, and I would have loved to have learned them earlier. So I'm hoping that maybe this will be helpful for everybody in the audience. So let me just. So for the agenda for today, first I'm going to talk, as I mentioned before, is about getting started and some of the what I would consider the foundational steps before you even start dragging objects into the Simio model. And we're going to kind of go into that. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about data-driven and data-generated modeling. We talk about those concepts quite a lot here at Simio, so I just kind of want to touch upon those because they are quite impactful in terms of how you build models, and they are one of the best practices that we do preach here. Next, I'm going to talk about what I would consider my favorite two topics, which are documentation and debugging, because they don't really get talked a lot about. So in documentation, just really why it's important, why to do it, and how to do it, as well as sharing some of the techniques I've learned for debugging. As you can see, there's kind of four major concepts of this session. So I am going to pause at the end and the beginning of each session for questions. So as I mentioned, please submit your questions and I will pause to answer those. I'm trying to make the session as engaging as possible. So getting started. Before you even start building your Simio models, it's really important that you are aware of the purpose of your model. And one of the things we like to preach here is spending some time to define really clearly what's your objective of the model and what are you trying to answer. Additionally, what is the data that you have available to you and what are the deliverables? And this all might seem quite obvious, but it kind of gets easy to jump into the model and start modeling stuff and lose track of what is actually your objective. And of course, the objective might be changed depending on what kind of input data is required. And all of that really is encapsulated in this functional specification document. And in the functional spec, depending on your core company or your use case or your organization, will always be different in some flavor. But again, it should always be a document that specifies in a pretty good level of detail what is the objective of this model. And it really clearly defines that scope. And sometimes I've heard that there's this conception that it's kind of taking away from the model building, because model building, in my opinion, is quite fun. And this kind of seems like documentation and whatnot, but I would really fight against that because without having that functional spec document, it's so easy to lose track of the objective of this model and for your project to then potentially go out of scope. And likewise, it's always good to then understand what is, if you are truly making a data generated model, do you have that data available? So you could have this great objective and you could have these questions, but maybe it's not feasible. So all of this kind of pre-leg research is really important to help set up your project for success. And that's kind of what this whole talk is going to be talking about, which is what can we do here and as a modeler to set yourself up for success. So getting started and stepping off on the right foot is creating this functional spec document. The next thing, and this is more of a philosophical approach, which is really truly internalizing this idea of building models using an iterative model approach. So what do I mean by that? That means you should get in the habit, and at first it's kind of a little strange, or maybe I'll tell you how I used to build models when I was in college and tell you how I build models now. It's very common to just build, and drag objects and keep layering in features and features and features because, as I mentioned, it's fun. It's to keep doing that. And then at the end of the semester and end of the project, then I would start debugging it and testing it. And maybe you can see where I'm going with this, but using that approach, the debugging and the testing is very, very challenging because there's just so much there. When I started Simio, I learned of this approach, which is kind of to do an iterative approach, which is build something, test, build, test, and do this in these small chunks and really to truly internalize this, because that way when you're testing, the testing that you have to focus in on is just a smaller subset because you didn't change so much the model since when you last tested. And using this approach, it's kind of like similar to a sprint approach of building, testing, building, testing, building, testing, that you can always, in a sense, you always have a model that's runnable, as well as the burden of debugging and testing, which if you haven't gotten to that bridge yet, you'll realize you spend most of your time debugging models is helped and kind of it's a little easier if you're doing it in chunks as opposed to doing it all at one massive time at the end of the projects. Additionally, when you are running models and testing models, it's always good to have an expectation before you click that run button. So what do I mean by this? It's if you developed a feature in Simio and you're like, okay, I think the model is going to do this. Run it. Did it do it? Did it not do it? And help to further understand what the model's doing and to make sure that what you think the model's doing is aligned with what the model's actually doing. Because I've been in many situations where I built the model, I thought I totally understood the logic, and then it didn't do what I expected. But I didn't set an expectation, so I thought it was working correct. But it was later, during more testing, that I saw that there's actually some logical flaws in what I was doing, my process logic. So again, I'm going to mention this iterative modeling approach a few times during this session because I think it's really a powerful way to build models, is to kind of do this cyclic approach. And lastly, the last point probably should have been the first, which is get in the habit of saving early and saving often. I had a professor of mine, and this is kind of an extreme example, but he used to have a 15-minute timer when we were in labs working on models to save, because he had so many students that had not saved and something would happen or the power would go out in the lab or something and they lose their models. So that's kind of an extreme example, but just get in the habit of saving routinely. Control S only takes a half a second to do it in your model, but just get in the habit of saving. It'll save yourself a lot of time and set you up for success. Okay, getting started, more topics. This is something that I learned actually when I started Simio, which is when you're in process logic, and this is a little bit subjective, but I think it helped a lot, is trying to at all costs avoid double negatives. So what do I mean by that? So if you were to look at this process one snippet that I'm showing here, this is just a simple decide block. I'm sure everyone's used it. Used decide blocks are probably one of the most commonly used steps in process logic. And of course, a decide block just evaluates true or false based on some sort of condition or probability. But if you see here, what I did here is I had the test boolean, if the decide is false, then it returns true. And if the decide is true, it returns false. I mean, you can see right now, I can't even say it without getting kind of mixed up. So these are the type of situations that when you're building your process logic, if you can avoid them, it's going to save yourself a lot of headache in the long run. And maybe you can understand it. And I'm not saying you have to follow this rule, but from experience, as your models get more and more complex and you do have these in there, it's kind of challenging to go through the logic and to understand how it's actually working. especially debugging. Because as I mentioned before, one of the major points of building a model is, can you test it and can you validate it? And with these double negatives, it just makes it a little bit harder, in my opinion, than it kind of needs to be. Granted, if you are adding logic to a pre-existing process, maybe this isn't possible, and of course that's fine. Simio's not going to like yell at you if you do this, but I'm just saying from practical experience debugging a lot of models, these are a little bit more challenging, and if you can avoid them, you'll be happy that you can. The next topic I want to talk about is kind of developing a method for saving as well as tracking changes. So these are topics that I never really established before I started at Simio, but as you build more and more models and in your progress, as you become a better Simio modeler and during your Simio journey, it's not a bad idea to develop a method for you, whatever works for you, for tracking saved projects. So for example, and there's a lot of different ways to do this, but it's really just developing a system that works for you. It could just be simply a spreadsheet that has the file name and what was changed and the date. That's like the most rudimentary, and that's typically what I do, honestly. It doesn't take more than a few seconds each day to update this log, just so that I know if I need to put this model down, because we all have many different obligations that we're tending to, that I can pick this back up and I can know what was I doing in that model and where did I leave off. Additionally, and this is kind of related, you can also develop a standard for naming conventions of the models. So of course you can name the model and anything you want, but I think that sometimes you can include certain pieces of information in the model saving and the name to help you access that data, or access the model, as well as understand where you left off, and to help you pick the right model if you do have some sort of repository. So typically now, what I'll add is I'll add the date of the save, typically with the model's name, maybe if it's a client model, who the client is. If you have multiple modelers, it's not a bad idea to add your initials to it, as well as what was changed and the Simio version. The Simio version is potentially not as likely if you don't change often, but obviously being at Simio, we do change the versions quite often to utilize all the new features that development's constantly working on. So you can see that the second to the bottom bullet point, for example, 322.23 underscore client model underscore my initials, JDC, underscore updated routing underscore 250, which would be the Simio version. So, and of course you can have this be as long as you want. I have some clients that I've seen 10 or more than 10 underscores, and that just works for them in terms of keeping track of their models. And again, the point is not to tell you what's best, it's just to say it's a good idea to develop a standard and a method so that you can help, again, set yourself up for success later down as you have more models potentially, and you're just getting more and more complex with your models. And the last thing is, it's not a bad idea to save your models periodically and branch off on them. So typically, if I'm working in Logic and I'm implementing new features, I will do it probably daily or maybe every other day and just date it with what it left, so that if I need to revert back to a previous model, I have that available. I don't need to more or less undo a lot of things. And again, it's just a way to track models. Okay. As I mentioned before, I'm just going to take a quick pause to see if there's any questions before I move on to the next topic.
No questions yet, Jason.
Okay, great. Okay, so next we're going to talk about this concept that we at Simio, we talk quite a lot about, which is data-driven and data-generated modeling. So first, I'll quickly mention what it is, and then I'll kind of talk to you about why it's a really powerful way to be building models. So data-driven modeling means that you're using data to really control and manipulate all of the model. So in a sense, you're storing all of the data or all the information in your model inside of data tables or tabular formats of data. And this allows you to easily maintain models as well as provide single sources for data. So if you do need to change data or need to change something about the model, it would just be a single source. And I think the best way to really talk about this is to talk about how I used to previously build models. And again, there's never a wrong way to build a model. We're just telling you what we've done with many clients and what it seems to work for me. And that is, it's really easy to just start building and putting all this data in the objects themselves. And there's nothing wrong with that. But to make it easier for yourself, if you can have these objects and point them to data tables and have a central table that stores all the data for that model, then when it comes to change the data or to even also to debug that model, it's a little bit easier. And at this point now, I've been at Simio for about 9 years. I've been using Simio for about 9 years, excuse me. When I build models, my main purpose is, of course, to achieve the objective, but it's to, can I debug this model, and what's the easiest way to debug this model so that I can always confirm and validate that the model is correct? Because that's the most important part when you're building models. You have to have confidence in your models. So I believe there's ways to build your models that make it easier to validate and debug. So, and one of those is using data tables. Additionally, you can have multiple objects that can all point to the same source. So again, this is another thing I've just mentioned a second ago, just a single source of data, and all the objects then point to those single sources. A little bit of a how-to, so you can just reference data in tables as well. So it's very similar to reference properties, and here's some syntax for you. This is widely available in the help text as well, but just a quick thing so you can reference certain cells and whatnot. These are really nice to know if you're setting up experiments, if that is what the objective of your model or your project requires is experimentation. Using tables and using them like properties can help you in your experiment windows and running experiments more efficiently. Additionally, you can use it when objects, excuse me, let me back up. If you do have foreign keys or you do have a relationship structure, you wouldn't have to use the row number. That's a little bit technical aside, but just in there for your information. And the last point is for data tables is to utilize foreign keys. So foreign keys allow you to set up these parent and child tables, and it really allows you to more or less minimize potential rows that you're searching. So in Simio, we like to say there really is no limit to the amount of data that you can bring in. But of course, if you want your models to run fast, you're trying to limit how much searching you're doing. And searching is kind of a really important part of Simio, especially if you're using these data tables, finding data and finding certain items or certain rows of data. But if you utilize foreign keys with primary key, utilize foreign keys with primary tables and child tables, you can in a sense minimize the amount of rows that Simio is looking. And if anybody who's ever done any databases, this is probably very obvious, but to me it was not when I started Simio. So there's really a power in utilizing foreign keys. So setting up that data architecture before you start building your model or as you're building your model is quite important to help with the runtime, as well as making sure your model is more scalable if that is one of the objectives you're trying to achieve. And now switching gears and talking about in the same vein, but data generated modeling. So before we were all talking about more or less having everything point to data tables. So the data was really driving the model, but now we're talking about data generating. So probably a few years ago now, we rolled out this feature that you can auto create objects via tables. And this feature is in a lot of our examples. It's definitely in Simbits. So if you're not familiar with that feature, I would definitely recommend you to open up the software and search that in the help text and find those example models to see how this works. But at the high level, what this allows you to do is it allows you to specify an object name and an object type. And by creating a row of data, you can then create an object in your facility window that would be placed at a corresponding XZ location. So you can really, in a sense, paste, once you have the structure of the table set up, you can paste in data and the objects will be created for you. And this is a really powerful way to rapidly build models. So it allows, and this is a really great way if you want to templatize models, you can use that using this auto creation. So you don't have to drag and drop, you always can, but you don't have to drag and drop objects. Additionally, if you would like to make your own objects, you can create these and utilize flexible objects. That when I say flexible objects, I'm referring to an object that just points to a data table. So in a sense, you'd place this instance of an object down, and that object would then just point or have all these references to tables, so that you would just then be changing the data table to then change the behavior of that object. So you can see what I'm kind of getting at is this allows you to really scale and rapidly build the model by just changing data and not having to go in and change potentially hundreds or thousands of object definitions. You can just change type and more or less update data. Also, you can store the instances and point them to tables. You can also pull out like task sequences, for example, and store those in tables as well, which is a really powerful way. And again, this is all about trying to set yourself up for success. So you can keep all this data centrally located. These are also really nice when you are setting up, if you are going after a digital twin or whatnot, having that data in a table can allow it to be linked up to one of our data connectors, which is another really powerful feature, as well as resource requirements. So all of those tables or all those properties that are inside of an object, you can link those directly to tables as well. And that is something that I always do with all my models now. Again, I'm going to pause for a second to see if there's any questions on the data-driven or data-generated topics.
Not yet, Jason.
Okay. Okay, so now to what I would consider my favorite topic, which is documentation strategies. The whole point of documenting your model is really trying to make it so you can understand your model when you're debugging, explaining to somebody else, or just validating it in general. So because of that, and to try to promote that message, I am a strong believer, and I think most people at Simio are, that you should be documenting all your processes and steps. And I'm sure as soon as I said that, some people were cringing because they just thought that, my God, that would take so long. And I'm here to tell you that it won't take that long, and it's time very well spent. And I'm hoping by the end of the slide, or the next 2 slides, that I'll convince you why. And then if not, when I get to debugging, I hope it further convinces you. So at a minimum, I believe that everyone should be changing the default names of processes and process steps. And the main reason for this is because when you are in trace or you're debugging errors, if you have changed those names, it is so much easier to then pinpoint where that error is occurring. And these descriptions don't have to be long, the names don't have to be long. It could just be 3 words. For example, update process step, or update process step 2 or something. As long as they're unique, they can really, really help you when you're debugging. Additionally, adding descriptions for processes. So each process, and I should say in Simio, and I will show Simio in a second, there's a lot of different options or different ways where you can add descriptions. You can put it in objects as well as processes as well as steps. And adding all these descriptions, the fidelity really depends on what you're modeling. From a personal perspective, I typically will add pretty detailed descriptions while I'm building models to help with my thought process of how that process should flow. So maybe I'm building this process and I know that it seemed to be working, but I don't have a ton of confidence that it's going to work when I do more test situations. So I'll have pretty extensive descriptions in the processes as well as the steps and the step names. And this allows me, when I have to go back through maybe the next day or maybe even next week, if I had to put the model down, to remember what was my thought process of how that process was working. And again, I know it's going to seem tedious, but it's really helpful when debugging, as well as just understanding and really getting your thought process down. The other concept of this, or that I wanted to bring up, is to develop a naming convention in your model. And this is something that I was actually fairly recently I learned about, and I thought it was really quite brilliant, is if you utilize the process names to your advantage to help organize the window. So many models, as they get large and more complex, you could have dozens, if not hundreds of processes. And sometimes organization of processes or navigating through that can become a little bit difficult. So one of the things that I like to do is I like to either have prefixes of my process names or process categories to help sort them. So for example, what I mean by this, it could be, if we're talking about initialization processes, I could have the initialization be 01 underscore initialization processes for the category. And that way, as long as I don't have anything, other categories that are less than 01, that would always be at the top of the process window. Similarly, you can then do A, B, C, D, or any other flavor of that in terms of your processes themselves and the names. So that way, when you see the processes appear in your process window, they would appear in that logical order. And I find this really, really helpful if you have a lot of processes. Additionally, I've actually was working with a client's model, and what they like to do is they had inside of the process description, they said where it was being fired and what was it firing. So you could then link all these processes together and help your mental model of how the model is working better understand. And again, do you need to do any of this? Of course not. Simio is going to work fine. It's really, and I said it once and I'm going to say it again, it's helping you set yourself up for success. Lastly, this one is actually very recent, and I thought it was quite brilliant as well, is having a naming convention for states and properties. So as you know, states and properties, they look very similar, but they have very different purposes. States can change, properties cannot during model run. So actually a partner of ours, what they like to do is they have all of their properties start with lowercase p underscore, then the property name. And all their states start with s underscore, the state name. So that way, when they're trying to assign a state or property, they just type in the filter editor s underscore or p underscore, and it shows all of the properties. And again, do you need to do that? No, not at all. But it's a really simple way to help make sure you're correctly assigning properties and states, or the correct ones. And speaking from somebody who's had a project that had a lot of states and a lot of properties that were kind of similar, doing this helped tremendously to make sure I was correctly calling the right states and properties. But of course, the big kind of caveat to all of this is that the level of detail required is very subjective to what you're doing and the modeler. I feel that if you are, as you get more and more advanced, maybe you won't need to be as detailed. I find myself doing quite detailed descriptions because it helps me to explain the logic to somebody else, or as well as to when I need to pick up the model again, if I have to put it down for like a week or a few days to get me back into the train of thought of where I was before. And again, the overall purpose is to just help a new modeler understand the logic or to help refresh your memory. Another documentation strategy here is to use the descriptions to help track changes. So another client of ours that they did this, and I thought this was quite ingenious, is if you look at what I'm showing here on the left is just a random Simio model, and I put in 8, 10, 22 and my initials to the description. And what Simio, and I'm sure you have most people here have used the search box inside of Simio, but what I was not aware of is that you can actually search and it actually searches through the descriptions. So because of this, you can then use this to your advantage. And for example, what this client was doing was when they were doing changes, they would put their initials in the description, and that way they would know from a previous model, they would just search the date and the initials to find all the changes that they'd previously made. And their thought was, these are the stuff that's just recently changed, so I should probably focus in my debugging on those things, and kind of helps you pinpoint. But because of this, you can also do a lot of different things with this. It's just a powerful way to then search and keep track of changes. So it's just I thought it was a really clever way to utilize the tools inside of Simio to your own advantage. And for the last technique, and this will probably be the longest of the topics, debugging techniques. Just a quick pause, but I don't think I hear any questions.
Sorry, Jason, my microphone actually cut out for a minute. There are some questions popping in, but I'll let you go ahead and get through this, and we'll ask these questions at the end, because I think they're mostly, they're generic in nature, so I think we could address them at the end.
Great. Okay, so debugging techniques. I would say if you haven't already experienced this, that not the vast, but the majority of your time as a modeler will be spent debugging. And my personal philosophy is that if you can help yourself and making debugging easier using techniques or strategies, you'll be more successful. And again, setting yourself up for success if your project or as just a modeler itself. So I'm hoping that some of these techniques will be helpful to you, and I'm sure we could spend hours going over different techniques everyone shared, and I would implore everybody to get on the forum and share this information because it'll just make everybody better modelers, and that would be amazing. So I'm just going to quickly show you some of the main techniques that I use pretty much on a daily basis, and hopefully they are helpful to you. So the first thing, and maybe you guys saw this coming from a mile down the road, which is test often. I've already told you before, the iterative modeling approach of building, testing is really important and really powerful. But the same thing goes, just testing all the time. Don't push it off to the end. I mean, you can, but I think it's just much more challenging than it needs to be to do it that way. And it's a lot simpler if you were to test as you go and just keep testing often. And again, how do you test? Set an expectation, run it. Did you meet your expectation? And kind of doing that way, really filtering in. But again, since you're doing it in an iterative approach, you should have a kind of know where to look if it's not working, and you can kind of streamline, because these models can get quite large. And I think some of the challenges is not getting overwhelmed when it comes to debugging. So having these strategies and testing early and often can help a lot. The next thing in debugging, and everyone probably has used it before, is trace. So trace is going to be your best friend when it comes to debugging. So for those of you who are not aware, trace is this button that you push on Simio, and it creates a CSV file that pops up at the bottom of the model, and it's actually giving you a log of everything that's happening inside of your model as it runs. But because of that, because it is everything, you have to be a little bit strategic about how you use it, because it will slow down your model dramatically if you do run it all the time. And for smaller models, that's not really a problem. But as models get more complex and the run times are longer and longer, maybe if you're doing a model for years, it can take quite a long time to run that with trace on. And plus, if you're actually then looking for something in that trace, which is segueing to my filtering bullet point there, it can take a while to filter it if you do have hundreds of thousands of trace rows. So it's really good, and I'm hoping with it, the next few points to kind of show you some strategic ways to use trace to help use it more efficiently. Because I think there is this concept or this belief to just turn it on and run the model. But just so you're aware in terms of how much slower it would run, if you do have a complex model, like a model that for example, a model that I'm running right now, trace off, it runs in about about a minute. With trace on, it's about 10 minutes. So you can see like I would prefer not to be waiting for 10 minutes to do a debug exercise. So there's ways you can kind of help that. So at this time, I'm gonna say these next 3 points, then I'm gonna jump into Simio and kind of show you them because it might be a little bit easier. So you can filter a trace, and I think this is something that I use a lot, which is using the auto row filters in trace, then highlighting rows and unfiltering, and then pasting in them. So I said those very fast, but that's because I wanted to show them in Simio rather than speaking to a slide. So what I'm showing here is one of the example models that's installed with Simio when you download it. It's scheduling bicycle assembly. It's a pretty nice model. It has a lot going on. It's a pretty complex model actually. And if anybody who's been curious about digital twins, I would definitely implore you to do this and to look into this model as well. But for the purpose of this demonstration, I'm not really going to talk about the model. I just want to show trace, for example. So what I've done before this session started, I ran this model for a single day to just generate some trace rows. And you can see we have quite a few down here. So say, for example, you wanted to then use this trace, because sometimes, and I'm speaking really for myself here, sorting through this, it is very overwhelming. You can see I'm just spinning, and it's just rows and rows and rows and rows of data. So one of the best ways to do, let me just clear this so you don't see it. So when you first open trace, you'd see this window right here. And what I was unaware for quite a while until I joined Simio is you can actually filter trace in Simio. There's a filter editor and there's the show auto row filter. So the filter editor would be what you'd see in a data table, for example, and it should pop up here in a second. So this is what you'd see in a data table. So you can add filters to your trace, or you can paste them directly in here. And I'm gonna show two things. So for example, let's just say I was debugging something and let's say I wanted this first order, I expected the ship date to be populated, but it's not. So I'm just gonna type in trace sales orders parentheses 1. And so you're aware, your screen is not lagging. I typed that at a reasonably fast rate, but you can see how slow it's taking to go through. And that's because when you type in this filter, it's actually searching at each keystroke. which in this model, which I only did for a single day, there wasn't a ton of trace. But if I were to run this model for, I believe 14 days is what it's set when you first open this model. I did it yesterday. It took me about 7 minutes to find all those results, which is quite a long time when you're just sitting here waiting for it to come through. One of the techniques you can use though, is you can just simply copy and paste this. So let me just show you. So you saw that took about, what, 15 seconds for me to type that in? But what you can do is you can just Control V directly in there and it searches it a little faster. Again, this is a little aside. It is, once you have a lot of trace, the results of this would be quite a bit more dramatic. So again, if you know what you're looking for, paste it is better than typing it into this auto filter. Additionally, so let's say, for example, we have some rows here, but now I want to look at what was happening around this trace, because maybe I want to just know what the assignment is, but I'm curious what happened before it. Maybe I want to know what happened after it. One of the things you can do now is if you actually click on the trace itself and uncheck the filter, it preserves what you just selected. So now trace went to the spot where that assignment occurred. And this is a feature that I use every day, all the time. As it allows me to then strategically go to a certain spot and trace. Because as I mentioned before, this trace could have 100,000 rows. So finding where to look and trace is not easy sometimes. So if you can have these strategies to then pinpoint to a certain spot and trace, it'll make your debugging a lot more easier, or even just possible in general, because I don't have the time, and I'm sure you guys don't either, to spend sorting through 100,000 rows to look for this one assignment. So to wrap this up, utilize that trace and utilize the filters inside of trace to help you search. Additionally, if you'd prefer, when you do trace, it does save a CSV in the same file of your model, so you could search in Excel as well. I typically do not do that, but I have seen people that have done that as well. Going back to kind of switching gears now and talking a little bit more about documentation, but really in the lens of debugging, is utilizing color coding. So this is pretty well, I think everyone, I don't think I've ever seen a model that hasn't been using this, but you can color code your process steps, and that'll also then color code your trace, which is a nice thing if you have if you're trying to then find your trace with the color coding, it just makes it a little bit easier for you. Next, utilizing strategic breakpoints. So a breakpoint is more or less a pause in the process or in your model runtime whenever the logic gets to a certain point. It could be an input node, it could be a process step and whatnot. But you can also add another layer. Let me just show you. By actually adding in process. So let's do it on this input node. I'm just going to breakpoint. And then if you actually go into the project home and there's the breakpoints window, you would see, you click on this, it actually provides you breakpoint properties. And you can actually have conditional breakpoints. So for example, say you knew that one entity and you knew the entity ID was causing you an error, but you didn't know what was happening and you didn't know why it did it. You could actually put in an expression that said only breakpoint when that entity enters this node. And that'll help you a lot because say, for example, this is one of the foundational nodes, and maybe every entity in your model, and you could have hundreds of thousands of them, go through that same node. You don't want to have to click through each one. No. The breakpoint would do it for you. So again, just another way to set yourself up for success. But again, it really just helps you focus in so when you debug, you can actually look for what you're trying to find. Because debugging is an art in some ways. And I'm hoping these techniques will help you get better at it because it is a necessary skill as you progress in your Simio journey. Additionally, in your process logic steps, I typically will add these internal steps or internal test assignments so that I can more or less understand what's happening in trace. So what do I mean by that? It's very common to do these iterative loops in Simio where you're just searching through something and it just kind of keeps looping and looping and looping. And sometimes when I have these types of situations, I'll actually add assignments that just update a dummy state, or maybe even just use a notify step to then export out what is just the state of that process. It's not being used per se, but it's really to help me understand the process. And I think when I first started building models, I thought that these were kind of like wasteful steps and I was going to slow down the model, but that's not a thing to worry about, but it just helps you better debug and understand what's going on in the model. Because as I've already said 13 times today, setting yourself for success is very important. If you have these strategies in mind before you start, it'll make your life a lot easier as you go on. And also, as I mentioned before, it's also an easy way to confirm that expressions are being evaluated correctly by just writing out the expression to a test state, and you can see that in the trace. And then in the last slide, so we're wrapping this up. So another thing that I typically do a lot of is changing the runtime before stopping the model. So when you run any model in Simio, you'd see, and you actually saw it in this window, is that the model is at the end of run, but it's not stopped. And there's a difference for there. What this allows us to do is we could actually go in and change the starting type, the ending type to 1 day, which is what it's at now, to 2 days, and we can just keep running the model. And this is really nice because what we can do then, as I mentioned in the previous slide, trace takes a long time to run. And if anyone's ever tried to debug an error that's potentially in the middle of your really long simulation run, you wouldn't want to turn trace on at the very beginning. Because if you did, it could take literally 30 minutes maybe for trace to run to that point, when really maybe you only care about the trace at that time. So typically if I have an error at say at 1,000 hours in my model that's running for, it's just for talking purposes, 2,000 hours or right at halfway, I'll typically run the model to maybe 975 or maybe 950 and it'll pause there, it'll stop there. And then I will extend it with trace on for another 30 or another 50 hours so that I can have the trace just isolated around the error spot. And again, that's just another way to be a little bit strategic about how you're using trace by not having to stop the model, but just by changing the runtime. The next concept for debugging, and this is really for as well as development, kind of applies universally, is getting in the habit to utilize small example models to just validate features. So as I mentioned before, a few times now, to build in these iterative approaches. So you'll be more or less building, testing. So you're kind of just building chunks of logic and you keep layering them on, kind of like an onion. But if you don't quite know how that logic is going to work for one of those layers, for example, or one of those blocks, it can get a little confusing to try to do that development inside of your already complex model. And if you have an idea and you already know, of course you can, and most of the times I do just develop in one model. But if there's a feature that I'm not quite sure how it's going to work, I've found that it's always really surprisingly helpful to pull it out and to build a small demo model to just prove the concept of what I'm trying to build and do all of that development in the small model. And then once you have the approach, then go and implement it in your larger model or your main model. And of course, iterate, and test. But doing this, it allows you to isolate the feature and it's a little bit easier to test as well as to debug utilizing these small example demo models. And lastly, this is probably something that I think everybody does now at this point, which is utilizing snips for getting a pop-up warning and message. So when Simio pops up with an error, as many people know, if you click OK, it disappears. So a good practice is as soon as you see that, to snip it or take a screenshot of it. That way you can look at the message as well as debugging it all in the same screen and looking at the same time. So it allows you to reference the errors as well as debugging your model. So that's probably a lot of information. So I'm hoping there's some good questions. Oh, sorry, I missed one last slide here, which is, with all that said, the last thing I like to tell people is to understand that you have quite a bit of help at your fingertips. So when you download the software, you have the help text as well, which is the third button on the right here, which is pretty extensive. To this day, and as I mentioned before, I've been using Simio for 8 or 9 years now. I still go into help to search things, and I'm sure most people at Simio do the same. So it's not, I still use it. It's still very helpful in terms of understanding syntax or understanding some sort of parts of the model. So I would implore everyone to get familiar with using that and to get in the habit of checking that help text if you're not sure how this feature or this part of the tool is working. Also, symbits, there's a lot of symbits. Typically, when we do roll out new features in the software, we will make an accompanying snippet for it as well. So again, if you're not sure how a certain thing works, like task sequences, I mentioned that once, if you don't know what those are or you want to know, you can open up a small sample Symbit model and it'll show you how it's implemented and how it's working, as well as with some text to talk about it. And then lastly, if you want a more bigger model, you go to the example models. I actually just showed you one. That was the scheduling bicycle assembly. That actually was an example model. So you can just look at those, as well as there's the online form. And if you want more text, we do have Simio University, which is something that Dan can talk about for a second. But on that, thank you for joining, and I'm hoping there's some questions out there.
Jason, great job. So I will say two things. First off, I learned test often, save often. I don't think you said that enough, so I just wanted to say it one more time. So test often, save often. But I will say in the history of doing these sessions, I believe this might be the first time we have more people at the end than we did at the beginning. So you definitely kept the audience's attention. We had no fall off. Normally there's someone that would log in, or people would log in, realize that wasn't something of interest to them, and they'd log out. But we have more people here now than that started. So great job. And yes, there was a bunch of questions. We have 9 minutes left in this. We'll see how many we can get to. All right. So first and foremost, first question? Is there any way to set up an autosave feature so you don't have to worry about saving the model automatically?
I don't think there is. And to be honest with you, I'm kind of glad there is not, because I've been in parts of model development where I was happy I did not save. So I think, generally speaking, and at Simio, we want to give you the controls to control. We kind of want to help Simio to only do what you want it to do. So I don't think there is, but that's really by design. So you're not over saving something and potentially you're not validated. And the reason why I'm kind of saying this is because if you do truly internalize the build test, you'll only save when you've validated that the feature is done. So it helps you always know that the model is working.
Makes sense. Makes sense. What about anything? Do you have any recommendations for actually like file control, managing model file history, things like that?
Yeah, so we are using GitHub. That is something that's supported. I would tell the person who asked the question to stay tuned. We are working internally on developing some features to help support that better. So stay tuned on that. I do have clients that use GitHub that check in and check out models that way to help source control.
Okay, perfect, perfect. All right, a couple questions. I'm going to try to bundle these into one in regards to your coloring process. So the first question was, do you find coloring steps helpful to categorize steps, which I think you already addressed that, but if you want to address it again, feel free. And then in conjunction with that, how do you color code processes? Do you do by type, task, object referencing, etc.?
Yep, so great question. So I typically do not color by type of step. What I do is I color by if it's an important step. And what I mean by that is, say I'm working in the logic and I'm debugging something or I'm developing something, but I'm not sure this is exactly going to work. I want to see. I will color code those specific steps that I don't think are exactly right, so that I can find those in trace. But the one thing about this, which I didn't mention, is that once you've then finished and validated it, or you've finished that cycle of building and testing, it's not a bad idea to then wipe out all of your colors from the process, because you know that logic is working fine. And that way the color that you add next will be highlighted in trace.
Okay. Okay, good stuff. And this is not a question for you. This is a question in general, and I will address this. Several people asked if your presentation was going to be available, your PowerPoint was going to be available. We are not going to, just putting it out there, we are not going to publish this presentation on the website, but if anyone would like access to this, I will spit my email and Jason's email back up as we end here today. So email us directly, and we'd be more than happy to get you what you'd like. All right, next question. How can you search for a model level or model entity level state variable?
Model level, Control S, that should search the states as well.
Okay.
Yeah, that should search the states. Yep.
Okay. All right. Can you elaborate on how to best use the search bar to look through descriptions? assuming model trace, but not certain on that one. Does that question make sense to you?
Correct. So let me pull up Simio. I think I'm still sharing my screen because it's a little bit easier. So they're different. So at the bottom here, I was showing, well, this is breakpoints, but there's actually tabs right here. So trace, so control search is control S. So I just popped open, oops, control F, excuse me. Control F, and the search window pops up. So the search window is different than trace. They're obviously they both live at the bottom of Simio, so I can see why you might think of it, but it's really, search is just gonna search through all of the text. There's some things it doesn't search, but it searches through most models and objects inside your model. So when you search it, it's gonna find them. So the question was, how do you utilize that for descriptions? The assumption is that you added detailed descriptions though. If there's nothing in the description, it won't find anything. So typically if there's something, for example, routing, or maybe you're not quite sure, or if you did the date that I mentioned in the presentation, you could add those into the search and it would find it that way. I'm not sure if that answered the question, but I think it might
All
have.
right. I should have been specific. The search block in a process, not the search bar.
Search block. Oh, like one of, you mean if you do search this, this description will be found in the search at the bottom. They will find that as well.
Okay, what I'll
Whoever asked
recommend
that
to
question,
the
yeah, send
yeah, I
that
was going to say
question.
to the person asking the questioning, I'm going to publish our emails here very shortly at the end. Feel free to reach back out if we're not addressing it, because we're almost out of time, but I want to get to a few more questions here. All right. When will the description field of a property or element be expanded when entering data? And then will users be able to add description fields via referencing data tables? Sorry.
Yep. So I think that actually is a feature request that we have as we go through our development process. So people that weren't familiar, the question was, can we actually expand this? And you can see in some spots it does, but other spots it doesn't. So here it does expand, as you can see, and I'm using Simio 250 right now, version 250. So it does show. It's just text though. We wouldn't reference tables. It's just text, and I don't really think we would want to do that. So it's just a string field, but we can take that as a request and see if the development team would do it. Again, whoever submitted that, if you would want to reach out to us with your use case, that helps further the request when it comes to development.
Yeah, perfect. All right, next question. Do you see, Jason, a lot of Simio and MRP users? I'm sorry. Do you see users combining Simio and MRP style modeling? It seemed to have very similar data features.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we actually built the models using this data table structure. And because of that, we actually have these templates built in. So this model that I'm showing right now, its actual data structure is based off an ISA template, which is based off an MRP system. So absolutely. So the whole point, or one of the major use cases of Simio, is using it to help make a digital twin. And usually we link that up to an MRP system to help schedule a factory, for example. So yes, they are very similar in that, and that's on purpose.
Great, great. All right, we have about a minute and a half here. Let's see if we can get to one or two more questions. Can the watch window be helpful for debugging as well?
Absolutely. Yeah, I should have mentioned that before, but absolutely. Yeah, so the watch window, you can just sit and watch objects. Correct. Typically when I'm debugging, I will typically have the watch window and the trace up in parallel. If you didn't know you could do this, you do both. So yes, the watch is definitely something that I should have mentioned, but yes, watch is very helpful as well.
That's why we've got triple digit users here to point things out, right, Jason?
Yeah, exactly.
All right, let's go to one more and then I'll flash our emails up here. So when building such large models, would you suggest utilizing the model hierarchy as a good method to build large models and debug efficiently?
It's not a bad idea to do that. It's hard to say, generally speaking. It all depends on your use case and your objective. So yes, using hierarchical modeling approaches is definitely not a bad idea, but the answer would always be it depends on what you're modeling. In terms of scalability, sometimes it's not that great, but again, if it's working for you and it's something that you see it's solving your objective and answering your question, so they're trying to answer in your model, then of course it's a great approach.
Perfect. And I lied. So someone typed a question in at 11:59 here, so I'm gonna go ahead and read it and see if we can answer it quickly. What is the best way to debug a model with data tables where the properties such as entities created at start of a run is not working? Is that too long of a question to ask or answer right now?
No, it's not. If the
Okay.
entities are not being created, I would say turn trace on from the very beginning, and Simio should then trace why they're not being created. Try to do that in a fast answer, Dan, for you.
No, that's good. I appreciate it. All right, let me steal presentation back from you.
Yep.
And just put up our email addresses so everyone can see them here. Right there. Make sure I'm sharing this.
Yes, you are.
All right, perfect. I know I'm not in present mode, but at least it's trying to go to present mode. It's thinking. There we go. All right, so there they are in the big format. There's our email addresses, dvasilini@simio.com and jsarasoli@simio.com. So if you have any questions that we did not get to, I apologize if we didn't get to them. I think I tried to get to almost everyone. If we didn't get to your question or we didn't answer it in its entirety, please feel free to email one of us. If you are interested in Jason's presentation from today, the actual PowerPoint side of it, I just need to check to make sure there's nothing on there that we can't share. I think that we'll be able to share it, but email me or Jason and ask for that, and we will take care of you. Otherwise, we thank everyone for attending today. We're happy to be back here for 2023 with the Solution Series, and we hope to see everyone the second Friday of every month. Thanks again, and good job, Jason. We'll see everyone in a couple weeks. Goodbye.
Thank you all.